I fell into a hole yesterday. It wasn't a hole in the ground or even a manhole. It was a hole in the fabric of reality. I was walking down the sidewalk in the middle of my small town. The day was the same as any other. Moderately warm, dry, and sunny. People were wandering around about as usual, pursuing the various shops on the strip and talking amongst themselves. It wouldn't have mattered if I paid attention or not, because one minute I was on the flat ground and the next I was falling. The abyss I found myself in was like plasma, almost like I was swimming, but it quickly ended because I was on the ground once again. It was the very same sidewalk, in my very same small town. At the time, I couldn't believe what just happened because nothing had changed. However, that was only until I noticed that everyone was gone, and as I mentioned earlier, the sky was sunny before I'd fallen into the hole. Now it was dark and dismal, like a thunderstorm was rolling in, and the town was completely devoid of life. The air was heavy too, like gravity had increased. There were vehicles, but they had no occupants. None of the street lights worked, and all the shops were barren and locked. If I were to say I was confused, it'd be understating the perplexity. I was thoroughly bewildered and admittedly scared. I started to walk and wander, without a way back or destination in mind. It was all I could do. But the sensation that I was being watched would not leave my body. From the moment I appeared, or reappeared there, I felt eyes on my back, and it didn't matter which way I turned. I walked around the corner of the shopping district, and then the park came into view. It was a typical park you'd find in a small town, with a place for children to play in, and an assortment of trees and benches adorning the sidewalk surrounding it. A subtle breeze whipped up like a giant had stumbled far in the distance and sent a quickly escaping breath in my direction. I found that the lack of sound and people was quite fear-inducing when it came to the abandonment of the entire town. Usually, I wouldn't mind the absence of humanity, but when it came to a place where humans should be, well, that's a totally different scenario. My eyes scanned the scenery of the park and something caught them. Next to one of the trees, there was a thin shadow standing like a frozen image in time, but it disappeared the moment I tried to focus on it. Still, I stopped walking and began to watch intently. Then, through my peripheral vision, I saw a flashing glimpse to the left of me. I shot my head in the direction and saw the tail end of the shadowy foot disappearing behind a brick wall. I began to walk towards it until I saw another glimpse. This time to the right. There were like little dancing wisps of darkness in the corners of my eyes that I couldn't focus on, or else they'd go away. If I were a child, I may have found it quite humorous, but something about them felt quite sinister, and that thought kept me on my toes. Their overall presence offered a sense of skulking, malicious intent, as if they simply wished for me to close my eyes so they could get close enough to take my life. As someone who partakes in the rather unconventional ways of thinking, I wondered if these shadows were the residents of wherever this actually was, or perhaps they had killed them. Suddenly, I felt a razor-sharp pair of claws rake into the soft skin of my shoulder with a grip like vice. I spun around while uttering a sound of exerting pain to see a fast disappearance of another shadowy being. The attack all but confirmed my assumption that they were violent and or evil, and that's all I needed to know. I quickly realized that I shouldn't remain out in the open. There was a pharmacy nearby with a second story that I imagine was an apartment. These smaller towns often had the shop owners living above said shops, and the sign on the door still read open. I was surprised that upon the initial cursory scan of my surroundings that I didn't notice that not all the buildings were actually locked and empty. I ran quickly to the door and pulled it until its rusted hinges gave away and allowed me to enter. The shelves were still fully stocked with all the manner of things, from medicine to snacks, but everything was long expired. It was still 2022, a newspaper confirmed that, but the products were slightly different and definitely out of date. I wasn't able to stay on the bottom floor for long because every time I turned my head, I saw another fleeting shadow escaping from my sight. The unfortunate reality was, I didn't have any idea if I was safe or not. In terms of how shadows work, theoretically, they should be able to exist anywhere a shadow does, natural or otherwise. However, I took my chances with the upper floor anyway. My shoulder was bleeding profusely, and that was the second reason I chose the pharmacy. Were it simply based on impulse, I probably would have tried to find a vehicle that was unlocked with the keys still inside. The fact was, I needed bandages, and although I was no longer on the shop floor, the apartment above assuredly had what I sought. I climbed the wooden staircase behind the front counter to the door at the top. It wasn't locked, and I breathed a sigh of relief for not having to break it down. But the door had something awfully heavy against it, because I exerted an awful lot of strength just to push it open. On the other side was a dresser pressed against the door in a barricaded fashion. The apartment appeared as though a struggle had ensued. Papers, food, money, and all manners of different things were scattered across the ground. But the thing that dominated and demanded attention from the entire entryway was the blood. Copious amounts lined the floor and the walls. However, it was dry. I wasn't sure how long it had been there, but I was more curious about how it got there. I tried the light switch to no avail. I should have guessed that because of the inactive streetlights outside, and decided to pull out my phone. No signal, of course, but the flashlight still worked for as long as the battery would last. Luckily, I'm a chronic battery charger. I need to keep my electronics fully charged as often as possible, or else my mind can't stop thinking about it. And yes, I know it's bad for the batteries. The light emitting from my phone showed even more blood. It was splattered with an intensity as if someone were painting with it, but I couldn't delay. My shoulder was bleeding, and that only added to the horrendous commanding color of red in the entryway. I wandered carefully down the adjacent hall, while slowly checking each room along the way. Finally, near the end, I found the bathroom. If any place would have bandages, it would be there. As I pushed the door open and shined my light within, I almost fell backwards. A decrepit human skeleton was in the bathtub. It was then that I noticed that the blood trail led into the bathroom, right into the tub. Several bloody handprints were covering the outside of the tub, leading me to believe that whoever this was, they were the one that the blood belonged to. I couldn't determine the cause of their deaths, but if the wound in my shoulder was anything to go by, then I assumed those shadowy things were the reason. When the adrenaline caused by the fear faded away, I slowly climbed to my feet and began to search the medicine cabinet. I kept turning the light towards the tub because my friend and mine have expected the skeleton to shamble back to life. However, there wasn't any movement to be had, and I put my thoughts to rest. The medicine cabinet was mostly empty, much to my dismay, but it did have gauze and peroxide, which was better than nothing. After disinfecting the wound, I wrapped my shoulder the best I could. When the gauze touched the bleeding trenches that the shadow creatures left behind, I felt an immensely burning pain. It was almost as bad as receiving the injury to begin with. I purposely avoided the rooms that faced the streets below because of the danger outside. I didn't know if those shadowy creatures could come inside or not, and I certainly didn't want to find out. The first room I thoroughly searched was the bedroom. It appeared that this apartment only had one. Aside from the room being in complete disarray, there really wasn't anything you'd consider to be interesting or of a helpful nature. The bedspread was tossed about, and the old wooden desk against the opposite wall had stacks of paper rising like small towers. If the pharmacist was the only one who lived here, they didn't keep a very organized environment. The possibility that this was all the product of those shadow beings did cross my mind, and it helped me rationalize the chaotic state of each room. After finding nothing of interest, I left the bedroom. Across the hall, there was a study of some kind. The room was quaint and equally as disorganized as the bedroom. There was a medium-sized bookshelf against the right wall and another against the left. This room had two windows, but both of them had blinds obscuring the outside world. Like the desk in the bedroom, this one had stacks of papers as well. Most of them appeared to be documents in the relation to the pharmaceutical accounts and other business matters. However, there was one lone scrap of paper with a quickly scrawled bit of writing on it that caught my eye. I quickly picked it up and held it to my phone's flashlight. This is what it said. They come out of nowhere. Nobody knows anything about them, and everything is going to shit real quickly. All I know is that I won't be going outside until this blows over. I have enough supplies to last me for a couple of months if I ration correctly, and plenty of pills to pass the time. It wasn't the most insightful notes, but it did give me a modicum of background regarding what had happened. The rest of the room had nothing more to discover, so I left and decided to search the room I dreaded the most, the living room. I dreaded it because the windows were uncovered, and the prospect of seeing a fleeting shadow in the corner of my eyes sent a cold shiver down my spine. I crouched down, almost to a crawl, despite the searing pain in my shoulder, which seemed to be getting worse. The contents of the living room were slowly laid bare. Two fully exposed windows lit the room enough for me not to use my phone, but after seeing what was in there, I wish they didn't. Two skeletons. One awfully small, it must have been a child, and the other, more likely, had been the mother. I felt an immense pain in my heart for the sight before me, and almost chose not to search the room for the sake of leaving the dead to their peace. But I wasn't going back outside, not yet at least. Under one of the windows was another scrawled letter, but this one was quite a bit longer and held far greater detail than the other one. It said, "Fuck! I spent the last 2 days by this window watching the streets outside, and those things just keep claiming victim after victim, and I feel helpless. but I don't want to die, and I don't plan on it unless somehow those things can come inside. So far, I haven't seen one of them enter a building, which bodes well for me. The letter trailed off, but then started again further down. The handwriting was different. If anyone ever finds this, I hope you're well. The man who owns this pharmacy let me and my son in, but was wounded in the process, badly. I don't have any sort of medical background, and he's currently passed out in the bathroom, and there's a lot of blood. I'm afraid he might die, and there isn't anything else I can do about it. I checked his fridge and found that all the food had gone bad, as well as everything that's downstairs. I'm so hungry, and my son is too. The letter ended there, but I turned my head to look at the skeleton of the mother and saw another piece of paper in her hand. I crawled over to her, and luckily, I was able to see the writing without removing it from her hand. It was weakly written. The words were faded and barely legible. It said, "So hungry. The screams have stopped outside. The pharmacist is dead, and I fear my son and I will be next. I've only been able to scrounge small canned goods, but those all go to my son, as any good mother would do. I thought that the light would keep them at bay, but I was wrong. It only delays their attacks. There doesn't seem to be anything to stop them, and it's only a matter of time before they come in here. Either that, or we starve to death. Forgive me, my son. I try to keep us alive." A single tear streamed down my face. I felt for this woman, for what she had suffered for the sake of her son. That unfortunate reality caused her to perish. It would seem her poor boy followed shortly after. But her note did offer valuable information, although the part about the light, my shoulder can attest to the damning inaccuracy there. Perhaps that's something to do with the overcast preventing sunlight. I wasn't allowed to think any further because a sound from below caught my ear. It was reminiscent of fluttering of a bird's wings, but much louder. Then it was accompanied by the crashing and banging, like shelves in the pharmacy were being toppled in a furious rage. Could shadows really cause destruction in that level? They could, of course, if they weren't actually shadows and just beings that appeared to be. My instincts took over and I rose to my feet to quickly move against the wall. I had an unrestricted view of the intersection outside where I first appeared and noticed several beings prancing around just out of sight. While they may have appeared innocent in their movements, I knew they weren't. The ones I could see watching me from behind various objects below had a piercing malice in their eyes. It was something I could sense, like a lion stalking you in the Serengeti. The noise beneath me started to migrate towards the stairs leading to the apartment. As far as I was aware, shadows couldn't produce footsteps. That's scientifically impossible, as darkness holds no weight unless the fundamentals of this reality work differently than our own, or as I said before, they weren't shadows at all. I rushed to the door, already feeling trapped like the apartment was my own personal prison. The stairs outside creaked with an ominous sound of footsteps creeping up slowly, but with an air of maliciousness. Then they all stopped, as if everything that once existed beyond the walls had vanished. I stood with my ear pressed against the door. Silence. Suddenly, one of the shadowy beings faced through the door in my own body before stopping just in front of me. I was able to study its gruesome form for a short time as it faced away from me. The creature was surrounded by a shadowy-like aura that concealed the nightmarish entity beneath. It was tall, lanky, and pale. It wore no clothing, only the shadow. The body was similar to a human's, if a human appeared as the hairless, withered creature from the abyss. I covered my mouth to silence my breathing and kept completely still. The shadow creature tilted its bald, white head from left to right while producing a series of low grunts and groans. I wasn't able to discern if it was trying to communicate or use some sort of echolocation to detect me, but it terrified me nonetheless. Then, it sniffed the air with an audible inhale that rattled my nerves. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to stifle my breathing entirely because a small breath passed between my fingers and the creature froze in place. Slowly, it turned its head and revealed two jagged rows of needle-pointed teeth with a distended mandible revealing a tunnel of black deep in its throat. The moment it saw me, it produced a horrendous noise likened to a guttural roar that made my spine tense up. The vibration of the cry crawled its way through my body and caused my hair to rise from fear. It tried to lunge at me, but I ducked and crawled to the other side before standing up. It began to chase me through the apartment. It tore into the walls with its own claws like a knife through butter. And the only thing I could do was make for the door. When it had backed me into a corner, I had an idea. I remembered it passed through the door as if it wasn't even there. So I attempted to run through it and was able to escape through the entrapment by moving through its warped, darkened form. I sprinted to the door and flung it open. It was right behind me. The destructive sounds emanating from the apartment made it quite obvious, but I gave it no quarter. I descended the stairs as fast as I could and entered the pharmacy once again, but this time more than 4 of the shadowy beings were standing guard. They all turned their attention towards me. Immediately, I didn't hesitate. I made great strides across the shop floor to the front door before pushing it open so that I could get back on the street. Once I did, all of the windows to the pharmacy shattered and the shadowy beings floated out like looming mist, aiming for my demise. I didn't stop and wait. Instead, I continued to run down the street where it all began. The beings started to emerge from every conceivable direction around me and were all quickly collapsing on my position. They shrieked and groaned and roared with various intensities. My body was beginning to give out from the swift expenditure of energy, but a saving grace appeared ahead. For whatever reason, the spot I had arrived at was highlighted by a single ray of sunlight. I rushed towards it without knowing what might happen. The shadows grew closer and closer, with their ripping auras wildly raging like black blazes as they outstretched their claws. I had almost reached the spot of light when one of the shadows closed in on me. It floated behind my back and swept at my calf. I tried to move my leg, but its long claws ripped into the muscle and knocked me to the ground. Despite the pain and the blood, I crawled on my forearms as fast as I could, scraping the skin against the concrete sidewalk. My hands touched the light. And the shadows screeched from every direction as a mass of them had reached me all at once. I thought I was done for. Suddenly, I was falling again. I fell through the plasma-like space until I appeared on the other side, in the same sidewalk, home. It was dark now, but there were cars being driven, which meant there were people. Since it was late, there wasn't anyone walking on the sidewalk any longer, but that was good for me because I had no idea of explaining what happened to me logically. I dragged my bleeding leg home, but something about the plasma between both realities had lessened the degree of my injury and allowed me to make it home without being forced to crawl. The moment I pushed through the door, I showered and then bandaged myself up. I had one missed call, and it was nothing but spam. It makes me wonder, if I had perished in the other reality, would anyone even know? The following morning, I drove into a town for some over-the-counter painkillers. Both of my wounds burned fiercely and made it quite difficult to sleep. The problem, however, is that while I was in the store, I saw a glimpse of something thin and dark in the corner of my eye. I thought the store would have enough light. I don't know what happened in the other reality, nor do I know what the creatures are. I think that if I spent even a minute more there, I wouldn't be alive to tell you all about it. Now, I'm home in my room with as much light on as possible because that's the only thing I can think of. But as I'm writing this, one of the shadow creatures has phased through my door and is currently staring at me from across the room. I don't know why it hasn't attacked me, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do.